question, and the question is, how many of you have ever dealt with a challenging or difficult person, or somebody who just doesn't seem to get along? Well, I'm sure the answer to that is probably all of you at one point or another. And, however, I want to take another perspective of this and ask you this question. How many of you, maybe taking a good look at ourselves, are difficult or challenging or sometimes don't get along with others? And how many of us realize sometimes too what we do, what we say, the actions that we take can trigger other people to be difficult? And the point I want to make today, too, as we talk about getting along better, whether it's virtual or in person, is that people are not necessarily difficult, but they're different. So, for example, a lot of us, we were raised differently, we came from different backgrounds, we see the world differently, and when people don't see the world the way we see them, we tend to see them as difficult. And to really get along today, what I want to really talk about is taking this a step further, is we really need to understand others first before having them understand us. And what we really need to do is we need to communicate in the ingredients that others find as important, but not necessarily what we find as important. So today what I'd like to do is I'd like to share some tips, tools, and solutions that help you, whether, as I said, virtual or in person, to get along with anyone, anytime, anywhere. And if you do that, you'll get along like these guys right here. And obviously, if they can get along, then you can too. And to get us into the frame of mind of talking about getting along, I always like this quote by Teddy Roosevelt, who said, the number one most important ingredient of formula success is knowing how to get along and connect with people. Another one, Nigel, a little more recent quote was from Nigel. I don't know if any of you have seen that show, So You Think You Can Dance. There's a judge on there, Nigel, and he said this. He said, it's not necessarily the best dancers who win, it's the ones they like the most. So the bottom line of this is, everything being equal, people deal with what? They deal with people they like and they trust. But everything being unequal, they still deal with people they like and they trust. And let me give you a couple of examples of that. For example, probably a lot of you have worked for two bosses. And, you know, one boss or maybe three bosses, and one of the bosses was really great. They did everything you should do to be a good leader. However, how many of you ever worked with the other kind, the one that's maybe a little sarcastic and arrogant and condescending and difficult, maybe possibly a bully? And you're going to do your job because that's who you are. You want to do a great job. So you're going to do that stuff. But who are you going to do the extras for? Who are you going to go out of your way to do things for? Who are you going to spend, volunteer to do things for? It's that extra one, the one who you like the most. And when you really boil it down to it, we've all heard that term before too, is people choose managers. People choose companies, but they leave managers as really the bottom line of it. So there's your likability, your getting along, really plays an important part. And taking this a couple steps further, just to give you a couple other examples, how many of you, for example, have ever gone out to buy a car? And everything was, the salesperson, the car was great, the color was great, the engine was great, everything about the car was great. But there was just something you didn't like about the salesperson. And how many of you ever had that feeling before? And then you walk away, and what do we say? Everything being equal, we deal with people we like and they trust, but everything unequal, you maybe just walked away and you spent a lot more money going somewhere else. Or, from an office, a workplace situation too. One of my clients I was coaching one time, she was a director of an agency, by the way, and we said everything being equal, people deal with people they like and they trust. Unequal, again, I was coaching her, and what happened was a vendor came in to sell something. And here it is. She's the woman in charge of the company. So she's standing right here. And I'm not standing, she's sitting. And there were two men, one man here, a guy here. And when they came in, the salesperson, he had the right price, the right product. He was a great he spoke well, he did everything well. But when he was giving his sales presentation to her, guess who he looked at the whole time? He just looked at the women in charge. Now, I wasn't in that meeting, but she banged the table later and she says, I don't want anybody dealing with his company or him ever again. Now, shouldn't we do everything by the best product, the best price, the best everything? But as we said, the getting along IQ and the likability are all key points that you need to take a look at. And when you put this into perspective too, the Wall Street Journal did a study a while ago too, and it's interesting when they ask how talking about hiring people even, and what they looked at when hiring people, and what is it? And they said it's not the experience, it's not the background, it's not their expertise, but it's how they connected with people people when they came in for the meeting, and it's how they get along with them. And then the other thing that was interesting to me too was people, and I see this when I work with some of my clients too, is when they're judging, deciding to hire somebody or not, they said, do I really want to work with this person for the next 5 years? And that's probably come up in your thoughts too when you're interviewing somebody. So think about that. So everything, again, being equal, people deal with people they like and they trust. Everything unequal, they still deal with people they like and they trust. And to put this in perspective a little more, taking a step further, Daniel Goleman, who, Daniel Goleman, let me get my slides here right. Daniel Goleman, who wrote Emotional Intelligence, says we're judged by a new yardstick, not only how smart we are, but by our training and expertise. And then taking that, it's not necessarily best dancers the one, it's the ones they like the most on that. So as we said, I'm just cutting through slides here a little bit. Here's Daniel Goleman. We're judged by a new yardstick, not only how smart we are by our training or expertise, but also how we handle ourselves and each other. And it was interesting because Harvard and Stanford University did a study, and they found out that basically people skills do matter. And when you look at it, the bottom line is that only 15% of your success at your job will be due to your technical skills, and 85% will be your communication, your people skills, and your emotional intelligence when you really boil it down to it. Now, by the way, this doesn't mean that you can be technically incompetent. If you're incompetent, guess what? You will not have a job. However, if you want to build cooperation, if you want to get things done, if you want to have collaboration, if you want to create a positive and productive workplace, you need to work on those communication skills. And it's interesting too, because speaking of communication, in the last 30 years of working with government organizations and private companies, I found that over 90% of the problems that come out of an organization are because of some kind of communication breakdown. And this can be because of misunderstandings, misinformation, miscommunication, or mistrust. And the key in this is a lot of this is inadvertent. For example, how many of you have ever walked down the hall in the morning and you say good morning to your boss, and they say nothing? And so for what is it, for the next week or two, you're thinking, do they still like me? Do they want to work with me? And it's, again, this impression that comes about. And by the way, people make up their minds about you in milliseconds too. So you really got to watch everything you do, because people are always judging you one way or the other. It's interesting, I did some work for Toyota and Lexus a lot of times, and it's when you go into their offices, everything on the wall says you're always being judged, you're always being judged, you're always being judged, which sort of makes you scared to death. But anyway, it's something to keep in mind, that people are always watching you and deciding whether they like you, they trust you, or they want to deal with you. Or it could be like a Zoom call that you have, for example. Even on a remote call, for example, how many times have we started off a call and we say hi to one person, but we miss another person? We say hi to one person, to two people, but there's somebody who's missed, and then they're wondering, why am I missed? And then we come up with the worst possible things. And as I said, a lot of this is stuff that we do is inadvertent. We don't know, for example, when we're being rude or we're being out, like on that case. So for example, I worked a number of years ago, I did some work for Chrysler and up in Auburn, Michigan. And when you take a look at that, all professional, we were going out to dinner one night, and all these people who work for Chrysler, who have dealerships for Chrysler and all these places, they're football players, they're former basketball players, they're former baseball players, and we're sitting down at dinner, and they're going wild. Everybody's yelling and screaming. I'm yelling, screaming. And about halfway through dinner, I just noticed, for example, that nobody's sitting near us. And then it just sort of realized at me that people were not coming over there and probably thought we were rude. But if I asked any of us were rude, we'd always say, no, none of us are rude. But the point is that we don't see ourselves. So the question I want you to think about today is, again, especially in this virtual, challenging world that we have, where we don't have that positive interaction, we need to take a good look at ourselves, because people just don't see themselves. So for example, I do something, some of you are probably familiar with this because you've had it and you probably don't like it, but I do something called 360-degree feedback. And when I talk about 360-degree feedback, this is where I'm coaching somebody, and then we do surveys of people who are above them, surveys of people who are below them, so they're stakeholders, to find out what they like, they don't like about the person. And then when I go to the person and say, hey, here's what people are saying about you, they all come up to me and say, oh, that's not me. My wife would never say that. And they go crazy on that. And I want to say to a point sometimes that people are a little delusional when you look at this aspect of it. So when we take a look at these things, there was a study done by the University of North Carolina a while ago too that said that of 1,601 people, they asked them, is there incivility in the workplace? Is there rudeness? Is there friction? Is there poor communication? And when they asked this of, 1,601 people, 89% of them said yes. But when they asked those same people, they said, are you ever rude? Do you ever treat people badly? Do you ever uncivil? Do you ever have poor communication? And guess what 99% of the same people said? They said, well, I don't do that. Well, the question is, who's doing this stuff? And that's what we need to know. And as I said, we don't see ourselves. Let me give you an example of this. How many of you have ever been in an elevator and you just don't look at anybody? Some of us have probably gone into that situation. You know how we look at the floor, or you look at the ceiling, we don't look at anybody in there. And I was in this elevator one time, and all of a sudden, I didn't know anybody was in there, and I start going, I start coughing really loud. I did not have my hand over my mouth, and all of a sudden, there was a woman in back of me, and she screamed. She said, didn't your mother teach you when you were coughing to put your hand over your mouth? She yelled at me. Now, that was sort of a reaction because I didn't know anybody was in there. And, the first thing you want to do is you knock them out. But I wrote this book called Get Along with Anyone, so I can't do that. But I turned around, I looked her in the eye, and I said, you know what, I really appreciate you telling me that because quite frankly, that's how I got this cough. I don't want to give it to anybody else. And I want to thank you for sharing that. And immediately, right after I said that, she said, you know what, you are so nice. And she said, when I tell people what I just told you in the nice way that I told you, they start yelling and screaming at me. And then she said, what's their problem? Now, I didn't have time to pull out my PowerPoint slides and show her what her problem was, but in her mind, she thought she was talking to me in a nice way. And I want to ask you that, especially virtually too. How many of you, when you're on the phone or on this, how many of you are making remarks, or how many are making sighs, or how many are making, we're not having the full body language that we have in the regular in-person world. So you need to take a look at that aspect of it. So taking this a step further, there's a term called moment of truth. And moment of truth means that every time you have a meeting, a transaction, or an interaction with anyone, an impression is formed. And this impression can be positive or negative, it can help or hinder, it can make or break a relationship. And what we want to talk about, as of what I'm going to get into, is some ways of how do you make every meeting, transaction, and interaction you have, whether it's virtual or in person, positive, memorable, and special. And one of the things I want to mention too here is talking about this before I get into some of those areas. I want to mention something really quickly too is don't burn your bridges. And when I talk about don't burn your bridges, Tim Cook, who was in charge of Apple, they had a story about him a while ago. He was at a high school reunion down in Mississippi. And he was with a couple people came up, and they all wanted to be his buddies and stuff. And one guy came up to him and says, hey, Tim, we're real happy and wanted to say hello to him. And Tim Cook went to him and says, you know what? I've had 2 friends in high school, and you were not one of them. The bullying, the stuff, people remember that stuff. So you really got to choose your battles wisely of the way you want to go. And I want to read you something here because I think it's important. There's a book called Don't Sweat the Small Stuff, It's All Small Stuff. And there's a chapter in here, and it's called Choose Your Battles Wisely. And let me just explain, just to read a little bit, because I want you to think about this and stop doing these things the way they said. It says, choose your battles wisely is a popular phrase in parenting, but is equally important in living a contented life. It suggests that life is filled with opportunities to choose between making a big deal out of something or simply letting it go, realizing it doesn't really matter. If you choose your battles wisely, you'll be far more effective in winning those that are truly important. Certainly there will be times when you want or need to argue, confront, or even fight for something you believe in. Many people, however, argue, confront, and fight over practically anything, turning their lives into a series of battles of relatively small stuff. There's so much frustration in living this type of life that you lose track of what is truly relevant. The tiniest disagreement or glitch in your plans can be made into a big deal if your goal, conscious or unconscious, is to have everything work out in your favor. The truth is, life is rarely exactly the way we want it to be, and other people often don't act as we would like them to. Moment to moment, there are aspects of life that we like. And others that we don't. There are always going to be people who disagree with you. People do things differently and things that don't work out. If you fight against this principle of life, you'll spend most of your life fighting battles. A more peaceful way to live is decide consciously which battles are worth fighting and which are better left alone. If your primary goal isn't to have everything work out perfectly, but instead to live a relatively stress-free life, you'll find that most battles pull you away from your most tranquil feelings. Is it really important that you prove to your spouse that you are right and she is wrong? Or that you confront someone simply because it appears though he or she has made a minor mistake? Does that preference over which restaurant or movie to go to matter enough to argue over? Does a small scratch on your car really warrant a suit and small claims court? Does your fact that the neighbor won't park his car in a different part of this street have to be discussed at your family detail? If you don't want to sweat the small stuff, it's critical that you choose your battles wisely. If you do, there will come a day when you will rarely need to do battle at all. So again, when we talk about making every meeting positive, memorable, and special, one of the points I want to make is choose your battles wisely, because you never know whether it's going to come back to hurt you in the long run. So let's get into some ways of getting along better with others. And these are some key things, again, whether you're in person or virtual, that I want to go over. And the first one there is appreciate to be appreciated, especially virtually. You know, again, when you're just talking to people and we have this isolation and we're not talking to people and people have all these things going on, make sure you connect with the people on the screen. You can't do that if there's 1,200 people, but usually in our small groups we can do that. You may want to have an icebreaker or something to just start off the meeting to bring people to be a little more relaxed as they're going. And when I talk about appreciation too, it's usually the #1 key that motivates people. So when you do all these studies of what motivates people, appreciation comes up usually #1. Now a lot of people come to you and say, well, money motivates is the key motivating factor. But money's important, and I won't work without money. You probably won't work without money, but that doesn't mean I like what I'm doing or doesn't mean that I'm motivated. So there's a difference between the two factors that key in there. Also, when we talk about appreciation, it is a cure for negativity. If you want to make somebody feel better if they're having a bad day, especially, again, I'm seeing this a lot with the people working virtually. They feel isolated, lonely. You know, the appreciation helps bring them up. And to show appreciation too, when you actually show appreciation to others, the hormone, actually oxytocin, comes into play, and you actually feel good because of that. A good example of this too is when you tell somebody you like them. You know, it's amazing. They're on a high for a week. And I always used to remember this. I used to work for the Marine Corps a number of years ago, and I had a general I used to work for, and every time we bring in a project or something, so I'd bring in this project, I said, hello, General, here's the project. And if he liked it, he would write DWD on it, which meant darn well done. And so I would go around and I'd show him my code. Hey, did you see this DWD? Did you see this WD? Did you see this DWD? And it went, you know, all over the place, and everybody's looking, well, I don't care, you got a DW, but it was like the ribbons, it was like the medals, it was like the, you know, the little green stars you got in school. People love that kind of stuff, so it's important to do that, but do it genuinely too. You can't just start telling everybody and giving them great stuff because of the stickers or the whatever you give them. A couple things also I want to say about appreciation too is Southwest Airlines. They have like a 5-to-1 ratio, and this is something you may want to consider too, is they train their people to say you have to say 5 positive things for every critique that you have. And it's not 5 positive things like, okay, you did great, you did this, and now you suck. But you can't do it that way, but you need to give them stuff, positive things throughout. So you need to look at things they're doing good instead of things that they're doing bad. And when we talk about this too, they have a unique thing too, and I would recommend you take this out of your vocabulary. If you have a critique of somebody or you want to say something to somebody, you say I have an observation versus feedback. Feedback gets people scared right away. So say you have an observation that you want to make with them versus feedback. So what do we need to do? What are some tricks we can do to to show appreciation a little more? First of all, there's an old saying, if you don't normally give appreciation, there's these rules that have come out. Everybody's heard the 21-day rule. You do something 21 days and rule becomes a habit. Although there's a study from England that says you need to do something 66 days. There's another study that says 90 days. Anyway, every day what I do with my clients is I say for every day, I want you to write down that you're going to say something nice to somebody. And so they do it, and that's what happens. After a while, you just start doing it naturally. Again, it's got to be authentic and it's got to be genuine. You can't tell somebody you're doing something great if they're not. Some other things that you can do when you have your next staff meeting, for example. When I go, and whether it's virtual or in person, depending if it's a small group that you have, I would tell them, the manager, I usually have them tell everybody and start off the meeting with one positive thing about everybody in the room. Now, I did this with a law firm retreat a while ago, and I said, I want you to say one thing, and they looked at me like, who hired this guy? You know, like, because nobody wants to do that. Everybody's scared of doing that because you're divulging yourself a little bit too. It's a little scary. But what happened is after they told everybody one thing, positive thing, and it's not like your hair is nice or your shoes are nice, but something like the fact that I appreciate that you come in early every day. Something like that does make a difference to people. So tell them something good. Then what I also had them do in some case, not all the groups I work with, but I had each staff member tell somebody something positive. And you can do this virtually, you can do this in person. And by the way, people feel good. And it's especially interesting too. I had a group one time I was working with where nobody really got along well. But they had to say something nice about each person, and it made a real big difference there too. So think about that. And then the other thing I want to take, two other things I just want to mention about getting better as why the importance of appreciation. It really helps burnout. And I don't know how many of you have had or had burnout. I mean, I think I've had it once. I had it once. I'm going to give you an example here too. I used to be a volunteer ski patroller, and if you're familiar with that, it's sort of like running. You're an emergency medical technician. You go down and you help people on the snow who have broken legs and all this stuff. And one day I was skiing down, and I've been doing this forever, and I just was getting burnt out. I didn't want to do it anymore. And then I helped a woman who was sitting on the snow, and she broke her femur and her hips and her pelvis. She was in bad shape. And I was the first one on the scene, and I did some first aid and some other stuff. And later, she wrote this letter, like a 4-page later, saying, geez, I really appreciate it. This was great. This really made a difference. And just because of that, it bumped me up, and I stayed with the ski patrol and kept going and was more motivated for that. So think about that as a motivation place. And then the last thing I want to say about again, getting appreciation and showing appreciation is the fact that a lot of this starts at home. You know, if you're not happy at home, guess what? You're not going to be happy at work, and you're not going to be happy other place. And I have right next to my bed, I have like a little, piece of paper that says, "Home is your sanctuary." And this is the one place you shouldn't yell at people. You shouldn't cut them down. You shouldn't be sarcastic. And it really makes a big difference. So you might want to keep that in mind too. Home is your sanctuary. It's the one place that you treat everybody treat your spouse or partner really well. So the first thing is to get better, get along better, is you need to have appreciation. So the next thing I want to go to is, we've probably heard this before, it's how you say it, not just what you say. And some of you have already heard that. And if you've ever been to any session in your life or any program in your life, and I'm going to, these statistics, this was done by a professor at the University of California a number of years ago, and I'm questioning the numbers, but just let me show it to you for a second. He said that only 7% of the message that people perceive by you or by the words you use, 38% is by your tone of voice, and 55% is actually your body language. So what he's saying is a large part of how you come across is your body language and tone. And so again, ignore the numbers because I'm having questionings on some of the way he gets these numbers, but a large part of how you're going to come across is your body language and tone, and especially in virtual meetings. People are always looking for those verbal cues that are you doing. So just make sure you have the right verbal cues. Are you just listening? You know, how many times have you been on a meeting and somebody's looking at their phone or looking off somewhere else or typing somewhere else? And you know, are we listening? Are we actually doing anything? And it's really not connecting. And especially when you're leading meetings, you need to pay full attention, keep your eyes right on the center of that screen where the web vision is, and then keep looking in that place. So how do you soften your image to make yourself more approachable, likable, and trustworthy? And I want to give you a few things. I call it the SOFTEN message, which you can do virtually and in person. Some are more for the other, but let me go through these. The first thing to make yourself more approachable, likable, and trustworthy is to smile. And when I say smile, if you do not normally smile, first of all, don't start doing it all of a sudden, because people will start wondering what you're up to. They just don't. Why is he smiling all of a sudden? Is he going to fire me? I don't know. So watch out how you do that. Also, only smile when appropriate. You know, if you have bad news to say to somebody, don't start smiling. For example, I remember this a number of years ago. I was watching a newscast, and there was the newscaster got on, and he said, there are 5 deaths in Fallujah. And he had this weird smile on his face. And that's a lot of times because of nervousness more of anything else. But what image does that give when you say that? And also, if you're just dealing on the phone and you don't have any virtual or non-virtual, you're not seeing anybody at all, watch out how the smile, make sure the smile comes through on the phone. And one of the things I've done with some of my clients is we've actually put mirrors next to every person's desk in that office, for example. And before they get on the phone goes ring, 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 ring. Good morning, how are you? They got to look in that mirror before they actually get on the phone. Because I can sit here all day and tell you to smile. Nobody's going to do it. So you got to make sure you do that. So the first thing to make yourself more approachable, likable, trustworthy is smile. Second thing is you need to be open. And when I say open, your hands. So for example, watch out that you do this. This is like me against you type thing. You ever get in a disagreement with somebody and you're doing this and they're doing that? It's like it's going downhill after that. So I am so conscious of how people perceive me. Or it could be like standoffish, or I don't want to talk to this guy. You want to be as approachable as possible. And to be as approachable as possible, again, whether you're virtual or whether you're in person, I always have my hands at my side or in gestures. So be careful on that area. The third thing is forward lean or focus. Forward lean or focus, I'm a big proponent of when I'm doing my virtual programs too, is to stand up because it can give you more energy, your voice sounds better too, or sit up straight, either way, but lean forward when you're making a point. So I'm not saying lean over like this, not leaning over upside down, but leaning towards the person. When you're in person, obviously focusing on the person you're talking to. Keep your eyes on that person and don't start. You ever go into a party, for example, and everybody's looking over here to see if there's somebody better to look at. But anyway, keep your eyes on that person to make sure you're on the right track. The next thing to make yourself more approachable, likable, and trustworthy is territory. And when we talk about territory, this is mainly for in-person type reactions, is getting into somebody's space. You ever have somebody when you're talking to them, they come up to you and they're right in your face and you step backwards and they just keep coming and coming and coming, and all you've really gotten out of that is bad breath. You just want to leave out there, but it's very intimidating sometimes too, and you'll lose that. So in the American culture, the ideal distance is about 14 inches to 4 feet. The next thing on there is eye contact, and by the way, eye contact does not mean staring at anyone. Now, virtually, what do we want to do? We want to we want to look into the camera to keep our eyes on the person. And we generally want to have our laptop or the computer we're into higher than us so that we can keep up with that. Now, that's hard because we want to look at the people in the meeting, but eye contact with that. Now, in virtual, in personal life, when we're in person, a couple things I would say is don't stare at anybody. The ideal time to keep your eyes on anybody is literally about 3 to 5 seconds. If you're having a meeting in person, when I say 3 to 5 seconds, don't start doing this. Don't start looking at your watch and say, okay, I got to get off now. Don't time it like that, but stay on the person till you finish the point. This is a really key point for people giving presentations. You ever see a guy giving a presentation, he's doing this, he's going, let me tell you about the 6 things, and they're looking all around, but they're never focusing on anybody. So focus on that person that you're talking to in the area. And then the last thing on there, to make yourself more approachable, likable, and trustworthy is nod. And I don't mean nodding off either. If I've seen this so many times, it seems like some of these speakers getting bored with themselves. And when I say about yawning, here's a trick I learned. I did a lot of work with NIH, doing some seminars for them, and some of the scientists there gave me this idea. Everybody, and you may want to just do this right now. Take 2 deep breaths. Take 2 deep breaths, and for some reason, this is a physiological thing, the oxygen goes to your head and you will not be yawning for the next 20 minutes or so. Now, obviously, sometimes we will, but it's a way to keep from that. So if you have a meeting or something coming up, because if you yawn, even if you're not tired, and a lot of people aren't tired, they just do it as a physiological effect, but what's the perception everybody has? And people make up their minds about you immediately, and they focus on that aspect of it. So take 2 deep breaths. Now, when you're on the phone too, we don't have our body language or tone, we just have our tone. So be very careful on that. So for example, I know people, for example, I've talked to somebody the other day and they were going, was talking to them on the phone. They went, which literally means, look, I got better things to do than talk to you. So you really need to be very careful on that aspect, because you're giving away these messages. You don't have to say a word, but you're giving away the wrong message all the way. So what's so important? So what? Why did I just go over this message of how to make yourself more approachable, likable, and trustworthy? How did I give you this acronym of SMILE, of SOFTEN? And the reason I did that is because there's two reasons why you want to do this. Because if you don't do these things, people will focus on you and not the message you want to get across. So if you're in my face, I'm not listening to a word that you're saying. And then the other point of this is you're not as approachable. So you ever have somebody come up to you, like I used to be a professor at Georgetown, adjunct professor, and I'd watch all the other professors and they'd say, are there any questions? And so one of them would do like this. And it was like, well, no, I'm not going to ask a question. It looks like I don't want to hear anything. So again, keep your hands at your side. So focus on this. By the way, this is American culture. This does vary by culture. And there's a good book called Do's and Taboos of International Travel. Every time I go to another country to do programs, because if I do these things, I could offend everybody over there. So be careful on that. So the next thing, words also count too. And you remember we said words were only 7%, but let me just tell you this. Words and language can destroy relationships. Words do hurt. Sticks and stones can break my bones, but words can never hurt me. Well, I'll tell you what, they can. And I've seen this in a lot of places where it derails relationships, it derails connections. And I want you to think about this. Before you taste your words, you need to spit them out. You need to think twice. Too many times we just open up and say something. And I don't know about you, but how many times have you not talked to somebody for weeks or years or whatever, just because of some words that came out? So let me give you some words to keep in mind, to take out of your vocabulary, that destroy relationships and destroy connections and force people not to get along. One of the words right there is whatever. When you say whatever, when you say whatever, people get 47% of Americans through a poll on the USA Today newspaper a while ago said that this was the #1 word they hated. Because when people say that, it means, okay, whatever, forget it, you don't count. So keep that out of the way. A few other words I want to give you to here are no problem. A lot of us use the word no problem, and for those born before 1980, that's a problem. But after 1980, it's not a problem. So what I mean by this is Ritz-Carlton and Hyatt hotels, a lot of these places have this in their training program right now. If you go to a meeting, if you go to the desk receptions at a Ritz-Carlton and you say to them, thanks for helping me, they're going to say, it's a pleasure versus no problem. And they'll get killed if they go no problem, because no problem means the other person's probably is thinking, well, was there a problem in helping me? So you've got to watch out for that. Now, when I say beyond 1980, this is a generational thing, and no problem to people beyond 1980 means no problem. But a lot of places that I work with are taking that out of the vocabulary because it has bad connotations with people. A few other words I want to keep in mind, just a few fast ones here. And versus but. When you talk to somebody and you say, you did a great job, but you're just dismissing everything there. Labels. Watch out for labels too. I've seen managers go around and say, well, that's very unprofessional. Well, as soon as you say something that is unprofessional, what does that mean? Nobody knows what that means. You need to say it's unprofessional because of this, this, and this. Watch out for accusing people. Take these out of your vocabulary. You did this. You always do this. You never do this. These are words. As soon as you say that, you're going to get me defensive. You're going to get anybody defensive because of those words. A few other things I would watch out is slang and profanity. And by the way, you just be careful of that, but it's interesting. A study came out of London, of England lately, and I've seen this on a couple other places. Maybe some of you read about this, but they actually said that people who curse are smarter than the rest of us. So don't have me giving you this as a thing to talk about, but they said it actually connects people in certain ways. So just be careful on that. I'm gonna leave that alone at this point. Also ask for big words. Some of us want to impress people with the big words we use. And I had my wife one day was saying, and she says, that's very pugilistic. That's very pugilistic. And after about 20 minutes, I went to her and I said, I have not heard one word you said. And she said, why haven't you heard one word I've said? And I said, well, what the heck does pugilistic mean? And she said, well, and she looked at me like I was an idiot. Pugilistic means warlike. I said, why don't you just say warlike? So again, think about the words you use. Also watch out for jargon. Like if I came here today and I said, let me tell you about the XL 4793, 10 minutes later, you're not listening to a word I said, because what the heck is an XL 97, 93. A couple other things, and here's the one, just be very careful today on this. Be careful of the 3 things to stay away from: sex, politics, and religion. Anytime you get into that, people are more tense these days about any of these things, and you can get into a lot of different fights on those aspects of it. So be careful on those things. And then talking about words, I want to give you one little help here too. How to say, one of the things, a lot of us have difficult conversations, or we need to say no. How many of you have wanted to say no to somebody, but you're afraid of how it's going to come out? So I have this technique. It's called the USA technique, and let me give it to you real quickly. Let's say somebody's interrupting you at work, and you can do a couple things. You can say, "Oh, I'm busy right now," and you know what? They'll walk away, but guess what's going to happen? They'll walk away, but they'll never come back again, or they won't feel comfortable talking to you. So let's say somebody's busy at work. Let's say somebody comes and interrupts you. So I might say something like this. I'll go and I'll say, "I understand this is important to you. So what I'm doing here is I'm showing empathy. I'm concerned with what they have. I understand this is important to you. However, here's the situation. And the situation is I've got this report that's due out at 4:15 today. And by the way, managers who give reasons give a lot more compliance than managers who don't." And then the third thing I would say is, so why don't we do this? Why don't we meet tomorrow at 4:15, or sometime do something later? So I'm giving them an action or alternative. And this can work like at a meeting. Let's say somebody's going over time in a meeting. I understand you want to talk. Here's the situation. We have lunch at 12 o'clock. Why don't we do this, this, and this? So it's another way to do. I also use this in difficult conversations, but it's a way to do it in a friendly way that doesn't get everybody bent out of shape. So another thing to keep us getting along really has to do with avoiding misunderstandings. They cause people to become irate, lose respect, lose trust, lose cooperation, and it derails relationships. And in this virtual world, a lot of times when we send things or we do slides or we talk to people, we got to watch out how the words come across. And a quick tip here to avoid misunderstandings is tell them what you're going to tell them, tell them what you told them. And by this, say, when I tell them I'm going to talk about this, tell them what you told them, and I suggest you talk about a story or a picture. About 60% of the American public is very visual, and so you need to create a picture in their minds, and then you summarize it at that point. So also, when we're on virtual stuff, I just want to show you some signs that pictures I took of signs of what they mean. You tell me what they mean, and let me just give you, because these could have different meanings. So watch your emails when you send them out. Watch everything you send out, because it can give the wrong message. It can get people all upset at you. So the first one was in Washington, D.C., and this was a sign a few years ago. It said, "Welcome to Washington, D.C., a work-free drug place." What does that mean? It should be, somebody screwed up the words, it should be a drug-free workplace. Another one, this was like the one I want to give you next was for a car dealership in Houston. And you tell me what this means. It says, "Why go anywhere and get cheated when you can come here?" What the heck does that mean? So it's getting a couple others here. The toilet going over the wall of China. What do you want here on that point? Here was a church. "Don't let worries kill you. Let the church help." Another one I want to show you is like, here's a way to get rid of your kids. Soccer not allowed. Soccer may only played in the archery. What do they do? Kids go back and forth? I don't know. Another one, I do a lot of work in Las Vegas. A lot of people had meetings in Las Vegas, and I'm going to show you a sign that was a number of years ago when I was there. And just picture this. In Las Vegas, they play dice, and the name for dice is what? Is craps. And I was in Las Vegas, and I'll show you this sign right here. And you can see I was like, I was really cool. It was like on this, right next to Dennis Miller and Rita. These guys are really old right now. But anyway, I was at the Ski Industries of America talking, and as their keynote speaker, and it said, "Welcome, Arnold Sanow." And I thought I was really cool. But then guess what it said underneath? It said, "Craps in the lounge all night." So you know what? It just, and I asked people, what's the point of this? And they look at me and they say, the point is you have a problem. So anyway, missing that. But, and then the last one here is, you've probably seen this in a lot of places. Unattended children will give an espresso and a free kitty. So again, watch out your messages that you have on those, and tell them what you're going to tell them. Tell them what you told them to avoid that aspect of it. Next thing to keep your getting along the best is attitude. And when I talk about attitude, people like people in good spirits. We don't like those Debbie Downers out there. Everything starts and ends with attitudes. And a lot of this is changing your internal message. So for example, you say to yourself, "I've got to go to this meeting. versus I get to go to this meeting. There's two different ways you're going to look at it. Or how many of you ever had a customer or a client that you thought was a pest, and you say, oh, here's that pest calling again. Well, as soon as you say that, guess what's going to happen to your tone, your voice? You're going to start treating him like a pest, and it's not going to come across too well. And so what are some things you can do really quickly to keep your attitude in good shape? And here's the 3 things I want to give you right off the bat. The first thing is to do the flip side exercise. And I did this with one of the airports around in the Washington, D.C. area a long time ago, and we had 47% less complaints because we had everybody do the flip side exercise. And we had managers all the way down to the staff, the people driving buses. They had a little black book, and in the black book they had to write, you know, what's the flip side? So when somebody yelled at them, what's the flip side? What's this? So the flip side exercise is this. Let's say you're stuck in traffic. Well, what's the flip side? Well, I get to listen to music. Let's say your new car got dented. Well, you know, it's about time that's going to happen. It also reminds me of like Christopher Reeve a long time ago. I was in a meeting. He used to be Superman. I'm sure the actor, Christopher Reeve, Superman. And he was in a meeting, and he would just sit there and he'd look around, and this really hit home for me. He'd go, and they somehow moved his head, and he said, I would change places with any one of you for any of your so-called problems. Do you want to take me up on it? And you couldn't hear a dime drop. So the first thing is do the flip side exercise. Second thing, count your blessings and ask yourself this. When things are going bad, ask yourself, what am I grateful for at this moment? I don't know how many of you do that, but that's a game changer for me. Every time something's like terrible, well, what am I grateful for? Well, I can walk, I can talk, I can eat, I have my 2 legs, I have my arms. I mean, anything, I can breathe. I mean, I'm alive. You can do all sorts of aspects that come with that. And the third thing is simplify your life. You know, I had one client of mine one time who was not getting along with anybody at the office, but we found out later when I did some coaching with him that he was actually just hated the commute from Dale City, which is a part south of Washington, D.C., up to Washington, and this was when he had to commute every day, and he just come in angry and upset and the whole thing. And we suggested before they were about to fire him that he move closer to the office, and he did, and guess what? He turned out to be the nicest guy in the world. So again, some things to think about on that aspect. The next thing to get along with anyone, anytime, anywhere, is empathy. And empathy is so important these days too. And when we talk about empathy, especially now, it's taking the perspective of the other person. And again, being empathetic also means, like, especially in the virtual world here too, we need to be empathetic of, you know, people having like 3 kids in the house at the same time, their dog running around, their husband or wife or partner there, you know, somebody coming to check the electricity. All these things you got to realize are going on at the same time versus just being in the office and having their full attention. So we need to do that. But empathy is really taking the perspective of the other person. And when we talk about taking the perspective, I don't want you to don't jump to conclusions on things either. A lot of times people they see something and they make up their mind about something immediately. And this causes a lot of dissension with people. They don't get along. A good example of this, and I don't mean to get political because I don't like doing that as much, but some of you might remember a few years ago there was a football player named Colin Kaepernick, and he was at a football game, and he was kneeling at the football game. And so people immediately had reactions. They said, this is good, this is bad, they hated it, they didn't like it, they did like it. But nobody really took the time to say, well, why is he doing that in the first place? They didn't dig any deeper. But what we came to initial reactions like this on that. So I'm saying, you know, if you want to get along with people, you need to take a step backwards sometimes and say, what are they going through? What's really happening here? Instead of jumping to conclusions on that. And this gets into that point, which we've all probably heard. You've all heard that term, like walk a mile in my shoes. We've all heard that. But I want to take it a step further, and I say, before you walk a mile in my shoes, you need to take off yours first. Before you walk a mile in my shoes, you need to take off yours first. You really got to put yourself into that person's things and take away all those ideas and conclusions you have about what's going on in that case. Not an easy thing to do, but something you can aspire to. A couple other things I just want to say when we talk about empathy. Don't do fake empathy. I had a session one time where I was doing it was an all-day session program, and a woman came up to me. She was sleeping, she was on the phone, she was doing all sorts of things and all this kind of stuff. And she came up to me at the middle of a break, and she says, you know, I really want to apologize because, I had a really bad pregnancy, and I was up all night, and it's been on for a couple weeks so far where I've really had problems. And guess what I said to her? I said, I understand. And she looked at me and she says, you do not understand. And so that's what I mean by fake empathy. Don't go into it and that. And then the last thing I want to say about empathy is don't hijack the conversation. When we talk about hijack a conversation, a lot of times somebody will say, well, I had this bad problem, my wife's doing this, I have a problem with my wife or my child or something, and then what do? We start going off and say, well, let me tell you about mine. And then it gets even worse at that point. So these were a couple of get-along keys I wanted to talk about today with you, and I want to leave you with a couple of thoughts on this. And the real bottom line, if you want to get along with anyone, anytime, anywhere, is I like this quote by Maya Angelou, who said, people forget what you said, they'll forget what you did, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. And it really boils down, everything we're talking to really boils down to having that connection with others that you really need to have. And one more thought on here too, and I'll finish with this, is everyone is like a plant in the garden. I mean, the people who get along, I don't mean to be touchy-feely here, but the people who get along tend to be nurturers, and let's just take it the way it is. And as I said, everyone is like a plant in the garden, and if you don't water and feed them, they're not going to grow. And I have this quote by Mahatma Gandhi, and I want you to think about this as we're moving, as you move forward for the day and through your working virtually or in person. And he said this. He said, "Keep your thoughts positive because your thoughts become your words. Keep your words positive because your words become your actions. Keep your actions positive because your actions become your habits. Guard your habits and keep them positive because your habits become your values. Keep your values positive because your values become your destiny." And he said, every day is a new beginning, and we must always remember that the nurtured seed always produces the abundant harvest. So I want to thank you again for having me, and I hope you have an abundant harvest through the rest of your career and from there on. Thank you very much.